name is Ariane Colson, and I am the event officer of Convened. Today, you're listening to our second series of webinars in the framework of the Generation Equality Forum. Today's discussion will provide you with an international perspective on the International Labour Organization Convention 190 on violence and harassment at the workplace. Thus, this webinar also deals with the mobilization, passant la vraie 190, literally translated, not without the true 190. It is led by a dozen of student feminist organizations and demands the true ratification by France of this international convention. First, let me introduce Gabrielle, who will be co-chairing this webinar with me. She's part of the group of feminist student societies that organizes the mobilization. Hello, Gabrielle.
Hi, Ariane.
I will now turn to our speaker, Sofia Sprechmann. Sofia, you're the Secretary General of CARE International. Thank you for being here with us. And before we start with the questions, I'd like to give you the floor for a more detailed presentation of yourself and of CARE.
Thank you very, very much for inviting CARE to this event. I'm really delighted to be here with you today. For those not familiar with our organization, CARE is a global humanitarian and development NGO. We work in over 100 countries around the world to save lives, defeat poverty, and achieve social justice. Women and girls and the pursuit of gender equality are actually at the center of all that we do, because we believe you can't fight poverty without fighting inequality. And today's event is happening as we are getting ready for the Generation Equality Forum, as you said, and at the Paris event, which is now very, very close. And as some of you may know, the Generation Equality Forum is organizing its work around 6 thematic areas or Action Coalition, and CARE is one of the co-leads of the Action Coalition on economic justice and rights. We also work in several of the other areas that are covered by the agenda, including gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health and rights, climate justice, and supporting feminist movements. But we're here to talk about violence and harassment and the convention. And maybe just to say that I'm from Uruguay. I live in Quito, Ecuador. That's from where I'm calling in. And so please go ahead and let me hear your questions. I'm looking forward to them.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And so we'd like to start with general figures on violence and harassment at the workplace so as to better understand the framework in which this convention is being discussed or ratified by states.
Of course. So let me provide you with some general figures regarding violence and harassment. And, statistics are actually staggering. 1 in 3 women experience gender-based violence in their lifetime in the world. This is, of course, also persistent and a pervasive problem in the world of work. Women are particularly exposed to being attacked or harassed at work due to these deeply entrenched power imbalances that prevail in many spheres of the world of work, if in society, in work as well. In recent years, of course, the Me Too and Time's Up movements brought the global spotlight onto this issue with grassroots women's organizations. They have been campaigning about it for years, but now it's much more in the forefront, fortunately. For example, and just to talk about the scale of the problem, according to the World Bank in the United States, 60% of women reported being sexually harassed at work. In the European Union, 55% of women declared having been sexually harassed at least once. And 75% of women in a professional capacity or in top management jobs experience sexual harassment in their lifetime. In Cambodia, CARE's research found that 1 in 3 garment factory workers experienced harassment at work during the previous 12 months. In France, 30% of women have been victims of sexual harassment at work. And victims and survivors are not protected. Studies found that 70% of victims actually do not report it to their employers. And when they do, 40% found that actually this translated into negative consequences for them in the workplace. And while we do not always have complete statistics, we do know that no country and no sector is immune to this. This is a global problem that needs a global solution. In fact, we're talking about pandemics. I think this is a pandemic. Gender-based violence is a pandemic. It's really, really interesting to think about who gets to call something, a pandemic. When 1 in 3 women in the world have experienced this violence, you would think this would deserve pandemic status as well. CARE has been working for many years to help address violence and harassment in the world of work, especially for women that we work in some of the poorest contexts in the world. So we especially focus on women in informal and precarious employment and those that are the furthest to reach and in some of the most opaque value chains who typically do not benefit from legal protections and rights at work. We do know that workplace violence and harassment is one of the most significant barriers standing in the way of many women to accessing decent work and fulfilling their economic potential. So it's a major contributor also to the gender pay gap. It has devastating and often very long-lasting effects on the individual concerned, but it also comes at very high cost to employers. Indeed, whole economies pay the price of the far-reaching impacts of this violence when women cannot fulfill their economic potential. The situation was already bad when COVID-19 and the COVID-19 pandemic, this other pandemic that is on everyone's top of mind, hit last year. And I think one of the most worrying impacts of the crisis have been the surge in gender-based violence experienced worldwide during the pandemic. We've heard about it. And in fact, the UN Women's Executive Director calls it the shadow pandemic. Although activists are now calling on us not to speak of a shadow pandemic anymore, to bring it out of the shadows and just call it an actual pandemic of gender-based violence. With many women confined to their homes, we all have heard that due to the lockdowns and other restrictions, there have been a rise in domestic violence rates. And that is really, really shocking. In fact, around the world, and this is measured, calls to domestic violence helplines has surged during the first weeks of the lockdowns as victims and survivors found themselves locked with their abusers. We've all seen that in the press. So this shadow pandemic is also affecting women where they work, in frontline occupations, in health workers, in their homes, in workplaces that have remained open during the pandemic, and also the digital space. Let's not forget about the digital space, where a spike in abuse, particularly actually against women and minorities, has followed when the work has more moved online. So this is kind of the very, I think, bleak picture that I want to share today.
Thank you so much, Sofia, for setting the scene. Could you tell us maybe a little more about the context in which the convention has been adopted?
Of course, yeah. Well, grassroots organizations, feminist movements, and workers' organizations have been campaigning for years for stronger laws and better protection for workers against violence and harassment. The ILO started seriously looking into the matter around 2011 and formally put it on the agenda in 2015. For those of you in the audience that may not be familiar with the ILO, the International Labour Organization, it is a UN body. It's actually quite unique because it consists not only of government representatives, but also of representatives from workers and employers organizations. So this tripartite body is then responsible for agreeing global labor standards and aimed at protecting workers' rights. And several drafts of the proposed instrument were released and very fiercely debated at the 2018 and 2019 annual International Labor Conferences. And finally, on the very last day of the conference in 2019, the new Violence and Harassment Convention, Convention 190, and an associated recommendation, R206, if you are fond of the technicality, were adopted.
Thank you.
Thank you for this information again. And we'd like to know more maybe about the states that were debating and discussing this ratification, and which states supported such a convention and which ones might have been against it.
So the convention was actually adopted by a majority. So more than 90% of the delegates who voted in their session in 2019 voted in favor of adopting this new international standard. Bear in mind that it includes representatives of governments as well as employers and workers' organizations. In fact, each country has 4 votes to cast, 2 for the government, 1 for each for workers and employers. And not a single government vote was cast against the convention. So there was no against it from the government, not other sides from the government side, but there were 6 governments that abstained and chose not to be in favor of it. Those are the governments of El Salvador, Kyrgyzstan, Malaysia, Paraguay, Russia, Singapore. They abstained. So no government voted against, but bear in mind also that not all ILO member states were present. Only 132 governments were represented at the conference from a total of 189 member states. So, those that were not present, it could also be some did not attend in order to avoid bad publicity or simply because it wasn't a priority for them. So also some may not have had the capacity to attend the session. So some of those that were absent may have voted in favor if they were present and would they have been able to attend. On the employers' representative, actually, we did have some votes against. 6 countries from the employers' representative voted against. Those were Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Malaysia, and Singapore, and 19 abstained. So of the employer delegates, 77% voted in favor. So I think it's also very important to note that the convention is the legally binding document, but the recommendation I mentioned, the R206, was also adopted by a large majority. This is not legally binding, it's a recommendation, and it provides actually specific recommendation to governments on how to implement the measures that are indicated in the convention. The recommendation is actually more ambitious. And again, while not legally binding, it's really an important element for governments to take into account. The government of France, if I may say, you might be interested, supported the adoption of the convention and voted in favor. But the fact is that the MEDEF, the employers in France, actually voted against this convention. You may want to know that. They opposed recommendations for an ambitious text throughout, and they have not, and then voted against it. So I think it's important. I'm not a specialist in the French contest, and if you have more questions about it, other partners from ActionAid, France, like Alice Bordaca, or from the French trade union CGT, Sophie Binet, will be able to give you much more detail. And I think in the context of a webinar, if I'm not mistaken, that you're holding next week. So it will be interesting to hear from them. So it's maybe just to say that there was a majority vote. And with the majority vote, there has been, a very clear signal that we need a new standard for prevention, protection, and for redressing against workplace violence and harassment now that it has been established. And social norms are shifting, and what was tolerated before will not longer be tolerated in the world of work.
Thank you, Sofia. Just before I move on to the next question, I just wanted to ask if you have a bit of insight as to why the employer delegates kind of decided to abstain. Generally, not speaking of MEDEF in France, but more generally, what were their arguments?
Similarly, those the ones that decided to abstain, again, the majority voted in favor, 77%, but those that decided to abstain had thought, what was asked for in terms of workers' protection was too ambitious or not implementable, if that's a verb in English. That is that, that the standards were too high for them to be able to comply. Those concerns were raised. And we saw that 6 countries of employer delegations voted against it, like the ones I mentioned. So they thought they could not be up to the standard the convention is asking for.
Thanks for that. Could you maybe explain now how CARE's work, explain CARE's work on the ratification? How does your organization mobilize around this ratification? And maybe tell us a little more about CARE's strategy to engage a wide range of stakeholders, maybe including private companies?
Yeah, of course. I'll be glad to. Thank you for the question. So for us, it matters deeply. In fact, for CARE, one of our priorities is women's economic justice. It's really one of our largest programs. It matters hugely. So this is within of our organizational priority, among others, as I mentioned earlier. But we ran a 2-year global campaign in support of the convention from 2017 to 2019. And together with friends and allies in the women's rights and workers' rights movement, we of course were thrilled when the instruments were adopted. In fact, the adoption of the convention, I think, marks a huge milestone in our global campaign to make workplaces safe, especially for the most vulnerable women. During this campaign, many countries where CARE works were very actively engaged. I mentioned we work in about 100 countries at campaigning also at the local and national level to persuade the delegations that were ultimately going to the ILO conference. So this includes, of course, our offices in France, CARE France. So CARE colleagues working in the countries in which we have a presence around the world identified, in every country could have been a bit different, the best levers of influence and the most effective platforms for conveying the messages. So each adapted their strategies and tactics to the local context, taking, of course, into account kind of the local power dynamics and political circumstances. So in some countries, the issue is extremely sensitive, which limited what was possible on the campaigning front, while others already had well-established campaigns underway, which could, be simply ramped up and enhanced and supported. So a key component of every campaign has been forging alliances, always with women's rights organizations, trade unions, and workers' unions. So this collaboration has remained central to also this phase of our global campaign, which is now focused on ratifying the convention, because the convention is endorsed and supported and voted for, but then it has to be ratified in every country for it really to be enacted. So in many countries, we have formed strong working relationships with key government departments, partly through sharing our research on the scale of the problem and our learnings from our programs about what works to help address violence and harassment in the workplace. In a number of countries, we also have been able to engage with the business community, and several of CARE's corporate partners have actually publicly expressed support for strengthening regulations around gender-based violence in the workplace. This multi-stakeholder approach is really at the heart of CARE's approach. So partnership with like-minded organizations is also key to help amplify the voices. For example, next week, actually, we are planning a week of action in collaboration with some sister civil society organizations in the Asia Pacific region, Action Aid, the International Trade Union Confederation, and the International Women's Rights Action Watch of Asia and the Pacific. So in France, specifically, CARE France has mobilized since 2017 with fellow NGO Action Aid France and the trade union CGT And we have now been joined by Human Rights Watch as well. They organized a lot of advocacy and communication activities that have been joined and supported by French feminist associations and movements, such as the Nous Tous movement. And in, I think, the webinar you will have next week, our partners from ActionAid France and the trade union CGT will tell you more about the details and recommendations that we have for French governments and employers. But again, you know, I think the useful role of CARE is that we do work with governments, with the private sector, and also with women's rights organizations in many countries. And, you know, in different countries, in different contexts, we may take, you know, an influencing the movement approach, or supporting the movement rather, or influencing the business community, or influencing the government. So again, it looks a bit different depending on the case we're talking about. But for us, it's truly a critical priority.
Well, thank you so much, Sofia, for all this insight. And so we better understand that this convention actually deals with a lot of different actors from different sectors, be it the private, institutional, at different levels, global, national, regional levels. But now that we have more insight on the process and the actors, could you maybe tell us more about the key protections that the convention provides states and workers with, and maybe highlight some that seem particularly interesting to you?
Yeah, of course. So let's get into the meat of things. That's the content of the convention. So, you know, if your country has supported it, and if it's ratified, you know, what is it that is in there that we are excited about and that will help to protect workers' rights? So, you know, we actually campaigned, and, you know, the allies CARE, we campaigned for the convention to be quite strong and inclusive in scope, and I'm pleased to say it actually is, because it covers a whole range of unacceptable behaviors in the workplace, which can cause emotional, economic, physical, or psychological harm. So it specifically mentions gender-based violence as being included in the concept of violence and harassment. So the other important thing to flag is that it covers all workers, regardless of their contractual status. So it applies to formal sectors workers with contracts, as well as the millions of workers in the informal sector, and those working without contracts. So it also applies to applicants, interns, volunteers, trainees, apprentices, and those whose employment has been terminated. So it really applies to the whole world of work. So wherever workers find themselves while doing their jobs. In other words, it really applies when workers are traveling to and from work, including on public transport, at places where workers rest, get changed or are paid, at training sessions and reception. It applies to those working from home, which of course is very relevant in our current context of lockdowns during the pandemic, where so many more people were working from home. It protects those working in also non-fixed workplaces, such as street vendors and waste pickers. The online activity for work is regarded as part of the world of work as well. So it also covers online abuse and harassment, importantly so in this very context. That was not, of course, foreseen how large this context would be when the convention was voted on and approved in 2019. It does not exclusively, of course, focus on women, but I would say the convention is especially important to women, that in jobs that are characteristically are often, in certain roles, there's a high risk of gender-based violence in the workplace, and of course, huge challenges to many women to justice and legal protection. So these include many home-based workers and, for example, domestic workers, and that's actually an area of our work that we have a lot of emphasis on, the people who are employed to work in someone else's home, where abuse can be particularly hard to view and address because it happens in the privacy of a home. Mm-hmm. So, it really covers the informal sector And I would also say the convention is also hugely significant in the recognition of the impacts of domestic violence on workers. That's another important dimension. So it is therefore directly relevant to our current situation of increased rates of gender-based violence in homes, in workplaces, and online. This point is really key, for example, for the recommendations that trade unions, NGOs, and associations bring to the French government. There is no provision at the moment in France that allows for the protection of victims of domestic violence at work. Victims of domestic violence often might need to be absent from work, either to hide from their violent partner or to undertake administrative and medical tasks if they have been abused. And they should not have to risk losing their jobs because they need that support. But at the moment, they're not protected. So countries like Spain, New Zealand, and the Philippines, for example, they have provisions that give extra days off to victims of domestic violence. And they have the right to geographical mobility, among other measures, if they have to go, really seek refuge from their abusers. But to make a difference to workers on the ground, it comes to individual governments having to ratify this Convention 190, thereby committing to meet, what I just described, this new international standard in their national laws. Without that ratification, of course, it is not brought to life.
Right. Absolutely, Sofia. I think you just mentioned this briefly, given the universal scope of this convention, but is there any particular reference to intersectionality as a concept, and more practically speaking, to take into account the most marginalized groups and women, for example, living with intersecting forms of discrimination in that convention?
Well, thank you for that question. That's really, really important. So, the convention and its related recommendation highlights that it's important for governments to have specific measures that address the groups that are most at risk, the most vulnerable groups. That's what the convention speaks about. And studies show that this is the case for women, migrant workers, LGBTIQ plus people, and people with disabilities, among others. So this is a key recommendation that we bring in France too, as current legislation does not provide for this. So yes, absolutely, it's very clearly stated in the convention.
Thank you. And a second question on that and on measures, because you already mentioned a concrete measure that could be implemented in French law so as to tackle domestic violence. But we'd like to know if you have other concrete examples on changes that would be brought about the ratification worldwide this time.
Yeah, let me give you some examples of them on, what the ratification would or could change concretely for workers around the world. And there's some promising examples. We have a long way to go. In 2018, the World Bank estimated that more than a third of countries had actually no laws against sexual harassment in the workplace, leaving 235 million women with no legal recourse when they suffer abuse at work. And although few countries have adopted laws since that report, there are still many countries with insufficient, weak, or patchy laws, and in 50 countries, basic legal protection are still absent. And another challenge is the fact that even in those countries that do not have the right laws, they are often not, that actually do have the right laws, they're often not effectively implemented and resourced. That is why it is actually extremely important for governments to evaluate their present legislation. The ratification can be a true opportunity for them to listen to the recommendations from trade unions, feminist associations, and NGOs mobilized at national level to identify the changes that are needed. In France, CARE and our partners, ActionAid, France and the CGT have very specific recommendations for the government on changes that would be implemented in the legislation. For example, adding sanctions for enterprises to effectively integrate prevention plans, implementing measures that consider the specific needs of the groups most at risk, and integrating measures that protect victims of domestic violence. Convention 190 takes legal effect in just over a week, actually, on June 25th. That is 1 year after the second country has ratified it. From that date, it will be a legally binding piece of international labor regulation. And but in order for the convention to have an effect on the ground, individual ILO member state governments have to ratify it. And by ratifying it, that government commits to making sure its national laws and practice meet the standards set out in the convention. And it submits itself to the regulatory oversight of the ILO and to report regularly on its compliance. So it also provides a really powerful tool, the convention itself, for advocates, feminists, activists around the world in countries that have ratified the convention. And civil society has an important role to play in monitoring whether the government is keeping to its commitments to meet the convention standards, and when they are found to be lacking, and any party of the ILO can notify the ILO of its concerns, which could prompt a request for the government to explain to the committee of experts on the application of convention and recommendations why it has failed to comply with requirements. So, and no government likes being called before the ILO and the committee of experts to explain. So this creates, I think, an important level of accountability. And of course, in countries that have not yet ratified, activists now have a very strong case to make. 129 governments voted in favor in 2019, and yet so far only 6 have ratified. So, and those countries, I think, well, the first one was my own, Uruguay, that's where I'm from. So, you know, Uruguay and Fiji, the first 2 movers that have ratified within a year of its adoption, and also Namibia, Argentina, Somalia, and Ecuador, the country where I live, Ecuador, that have confirmed their ratifications. But this is the time to renew and intensify calls on every other government to follow the good example of Uruguay, Fiji, Namibia, Argentina, Somalia, and Ecuador. CARE has been working with our partners also in the corporate sector and the business community at large. That's another area where there's a lot of room for improvement and action, calling on companies, specific companies, to recognize this new global benchmark and to strengthen their policies and practices in line with the convention's criteria, regardless of whether the convention has been ratified in their host or home country. So, you know, they could really lead by example in their particular context, even, you know, large businesses, even if it hasn't been ratified. So I think that's another really important area that needs to be signaled.
Thank you, Sofia. Now that we know how transformational and powerful this ratification can be, what do you think are the barriers to ratification by countries? Why aren't we, you know, seeing more ratifications? Why aren't more countries ratifying this crucial convention? And what are the roadblocks, basically?
Yeah, it's a really good question. As I said, only 6 have ratified so far. So that's a really small number compared to the numbers that backed the convention. So I think we have to be also realistic and recognize that the ratification of ILO convention is often a very complex and lengthy process. Some governments ratify with an undertaking that they will be putting in place the laws in years to come. So they first ratify, but they know that it will be a lengthy process in countries. And they also present a roadmap of when and how they will do that. And this is allowed by the ILO constitution, but others prefer to already have all in place, all the necessary laws before they ratify a convention. And so will only ratify once they think they are, you know, fully compliant. So that can be also a bit of a different approach depending on the country. Some that want everything in place before they ratify, and some that venture out, ratify, and it is allowed, and later get the appropriate legal framework in place. So in some contexts, so, when everything needs to be said before, this might require them to enact those new laws and additional provisions, and this can take a long time. So in most countries, there's a long process consisting of several steps, which could also include consultation, drafting, debates, and multiple rounds of voting at parliament and national assemblies, or other legislative authorities before it can go through. So usually the first step on the journey to ratification is to do a so-called legal gap analysis, which also tries to assess whether the current law in practice that does not meet the required standard. And even just this step can take a long time because the convention is so wide-ranging in scope. It often requires many different departments to be involved, and many separate pieces of legislation need to be evaluated. So all of this takes time, and some countries simply do not have the resources available, or what they perceive to be more urgent priorities to deal with, what they may perceive. So we know that France has done this legal gap analysis. They apparently found that French legislation is all good and does not need changes, but CARE France, ActionAid France, and the trade union CGT have actually prepared an alternative legal gap analysis that shows a number of necessary changes. So I think our partners that are better well-versed in the French legal context may be better equipped than I am to speak to that. But that is an important step, that gap analysis is carried out between what the convention demands and the legal situation in different contexts. So yeah, those I think may be the main barriers. Also the particular approach in different countries about whether everything needs to be perfectly in place or whether the convention can be ratified and tweaks to laws can be made later. And depending on that trajectory and the involvement and participation of actors, it can take a long time.
In order to build upon what you just said, and namely the fact that countries could either put all measures before ratifying the convention or after ratification, what does it change in terms of strategy? And don't you see in the putting measures in place after the ratification a means to lower ambition? And I am particularly asking this question because we've been in contact with a lot of people, and one of them asked us whether France could not add measures after ratification. And we didn't quite know whether this was an excuse for not having high ambition. You understand, if that makes sense?
It does. No, thank you for the question. I mean, every context is also so different. There may be also in some contexts the temptation to kind of ratify, because if then laws are not in place, there would be also consequences. So it's easier to ratify because, even if laws are not in place, in some of the countries that adopted it, there won't be consequences, while in others where the law actually works, unless everything is in place, it wouldn't be. So, I think, the critical steps for it to happen, and I know it is happening in many contexts such as France, is to first, of course, also build on very broad coalitions, including with feminist movements and women's organizations, beyond workers' unions and organizations. I think that's super important given the very strong focus on gender-based violence. Then, of course, build a very strong evidence base to make the case for the ratification. And it is, thirdly, very, very important to keep also raising the awareness so that momentum and focus can be maintained amidst the competing priorities that we all know of right now. So it's really critical to do that. But unfortunately, also the situation which the world is facing now, given the economic also impact and fallout of the pandemic, could be used as an excuse to not tackle the true pandemic, not the shadow pandemic, but the pandemic of gender-based violence in the workplace and violence in the workplace.
Absolutely. Do you think that some countries will announce a ratification before the Generation Equality Forum?
Well, would I have the glass ball? I mean, I think we all have high hopes, even if these are not based on any real expectations. We, of course, would welcome every single ratification, as it means more legal protection for more workers. And as I mentioned at the start of our conversation, there is not a single country where violence and harassment is not a problem in the world of work. That doesn't exist. So, I mean, we are very happy to also see France taking the vote a couple of weeks ago, committing to ratification in principle. We encourage others to keep working, keep consulting, keep advocating, keep mobilizing, keep campaigning, and keep asking your governments to ratify Convention 119 and stop GBV at work. In fact, those are two hashtags if you want to look them up. So hashtag ratify C190 and hashtag stop GBV at work. So everyone is encouraged to join in and support. It's so very critical for all workers and all women across the globe.
Thank you for the hashtags. I will just add one, hashtag Passons la vraie 190, which is the one from the student-led organizations, mobilization. So please use these hashtags if you want to make things move in a positive direction, so to say. Maybe a question that we'd like to ask you regarding countries. You have listed the countries that to date have ratified this text, and there's no EU countries, which could be surprising. So could you maybe give us more insight on the EU processes at stake for member states to be able to ratify the convention? Do you think that EU institutions have a role to play, could be encouraging, or that they actually might do the opposite and lower and slower the processes for ratification?
I'm not an expert in the European context, but what I know, and there's probably others that can much better answer this question that I'm maybe equipped to. But what I know from also my colleagues at CARE France and in other contexts, CARE does has a total of actually 9 European offices. So it is our understanding that there's general agreement that the European Parliament has to give the all clear before individual EU member states can formalize their ratification of this convention. This is a complex legal matter, and which is taking some time to resolve. Italy has confirmed that it has voted at the national level in favor of a ratification. And of course, we recently learned that the French Conseil des Ministres also approved the ratification in principle. So we do expect ratifications from EU members to be confirmed in due course, although currently it is hard to be certain when this might happen. And of course, this need not delay the process of creating or strengthening the necessary laws in line with the convention's requirements. But yeah, I think the layer of the European Parliament and the complexity in Europe around it may add an additional complexity that maybe in other contexts is not as present. And if I may say, and it's also not so, I'm not from Latin America, as you have heard, but it's also not surprising that in Latin America, in particular, you have seen it from the countries named. So a notable 3 of the 6 countries are Latin America: Uruguay, my country, Argentina, and Ecuador. And of course, this is a region, I can tell you, that the region is, of course, for its large activist labor movements. And that's it's also, shockingly, the region where many countries experience actually very, very high levels of violence against women and girls. So, I think those 2 factors also may have helped in Latin America to have delivered the ratifications more quickly in Latin America than in other countries. But I think in truth, again, each country is unique and their ratification journey is, of course, unique as well, and that must be respected. But I think in Latin America, with 3 out of 6, it is that combination of very high levels of violence against Latin American women in the workplace, as well as the important, long and deep trajectory of the labor movement in our region.
Thank you. And speaking of the uniqueness of each country, how can this comprehensive legal text aspire to be applicable worldwide and universally? And do you think that it can actually encompass the diversity and the wide range of sexist discriminatory behaviors? Essentially, what are the limitations of such an approach?
Yeah, that's why, and as I mentioned earlier, the convention is very wide-ranging, wide-ranging to allow precisely for the specificity of every country to be explored, and be addressed and be understood. So that's why we needed that kind of convention, and it be also defined and contextually relevant. So in fact, I think the convention in that aspect is wide enough to allow for precisely the uniqueness of both a country's situation and the ratification journey to be brought in. That initial gap analysis of is critical. I can't stress that enough, how critical that is, and that's a good place to start. And the governments may do their own analysis, and then social movements may do another analysis of and feminist movement of the actual gap between what is legally available in a country and in terms of its state of affairs, and the gap between the conventions. So if you're also seeing a government-led analysis being carried out, having an additional lens from where you sit and the gaps that you may perceive is an important action to take as well.
But on that, isn't the law kind of like black and white? And how can we, end up having one report from the government that says X and civil society's shadow report or shadow legal gap analysis saying Y? And how do we explain this gap if the law is the law?
Well, that's a really good question. And probably, and again, other people who may be lawyers, I'm not, maybe better equipped. But, even that when it comes to violence and defining what violence is, when it comes to, the complexity of the world of work, with much more online work in many parts of the world, what counts, I think the world is changing so very fast, so very fast in that respect. There's it's probably changing faster than what the laws can catch up with, if you see what I mean, with all, in fact, I read recently that kind of, and it's hard being a mother of a 21-year-old to even advise it, because I heard that what will be the top 10 kind of professions in 20 years are probably not yet invented, if you see what I mean. That means also the particular context, so the law is the law in a world that was more static, but in a world where, we talk about, for example, if you suffer domestic violence at home, when you're doing online work, how does the law have to protect you in those cases? That was probably not provisioned by laws that were designed for a world that didn't have online workers, and that's why, for example, as I mentioned, Spain, included that, the ability, okay, I cannot work from this home, let me go to another home further away because I'm then, not threatened by my abuser. Is that geographical move, will the law allow me to do it or not? Those. And why I mentioned my 20-year-old son is, of course, that as a mother, I think we're all struggling to even advise around the world of work because there's so many questions and unknowns about what skills, what frameworks, what may be required. So what I mean is this fast changing pace means that the law has probably not catched up with all the possible situations that we may have, we may be faced with.
Well, on that, we know that this year's Generation Equality Forum marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action that took place in Beijing 1995. And so we were wondering, what can we expect from the GEF, the Generation Equality Forum? Can it really be a platform for negotiation to advance on those topics such as the convention? Or will it rather be, especially in this virtual moment, just negotiations that won't really lead to any concrete action afterwards?
Such a good question. The Generation Equality Forum is, of course, around the corner in a few weeks' time. What I am excited about for this particular meeting, that those that lead action coalitions, such as CARE on economic justice and rights, but also those that have been involved, are expected to make commitments, concrete commitments with clear targets of what we are committing to. And that includes NGOs, our commitment to what will be our contribution to women's economic justice and rights. It includes the governments that are participating. It includes the private sector as well, and social movements. So, of course, where the rubber will hit the road is whether then the commitments that all this very different actors in life and movements and organizations and governments are making, whether then there will be the appropriate follow-up for ensuring their implementation, and what will be the accountability mechanisms to hold everyone accountable to those commitments. So I think that's always where the rubber hits the road. I am excited, though, to see what in a few days' time, what the collective commitment will look like from the different actors that are involved, and hopefully the addition will be a really inspiring one that raises the bar on gender equality, that helps us all live up to the true impact we want to have. Because ultimately, and if I may say a few more words, because I think it brings it to life when we talk specifically about this situation of certain workers, about what all of this may mean. Let's take domestic workers in Latin America, of which there's about 20 million, most of them, the vast majority, 98% women. If we don't deliver for them, then there's no point in even having those dialogues, and this is why the convention is also in this context so very important. There were, until very recently, in some countries even still prevalent, even two different labor codes, one for all other type of work in some countries, and one for domestic work, which actually allowed exploitation, because there was no minimum wage for domestic workers. There was no, clear working hours. They mostly start at, many that live in a home, domestic workers, and it's millions of women around the world, in Asia and Africa, in the Caribbean, and also in the global north, in the Middle East, where it's also transnational issues. Those are women that often live far away even from their home country. When they migrate to another country to carry out domestic work, these are some of the most vulnerable women, because in terms of violence, because again, the abuse they suffer happens in the privacy of a home. It's different when, for example, a collective is involved, a plantation worker, garment workers. They're together in one place. They have one employer. They have one employer, and they have the force of being united, and it's more visible in the spheres of the exploitation they suffer. Every domestic worker there's as many domestic workers often as employers, there's many. So where is how do you even, use a bargaining power? How do you bring them together? They are not in the same workplace. They're all fragmented, each of them in a different workplace, in a different home. So if what is going to happen does not deliver for those women that really suffer some of the greatest atrocities I have heard about, this is modern slavery, right now at this day, age and time. I've heard of domestic workers, eating not only the last, but basically the remnants of food, that is 3 days old. I've heard them being sexually abused at home, and if what we're going to do doesn't deliver for some of the most excluded women in the workforce in the world, that there's no point in even coming together. So I would say that will be the test. That will be the test against which we should measure, and I'm mentioning the specific situation of domestic workers also because the convention applies to them. We said that was one of the beauties of the convention, that It applies also to women that may not have a contract, that are particularly vulnerable. And I think that's where, against which we should measure anything we do if we're serious about justice and rights.
Thank you for this. Yeah, and thank you for underscoring the importance of leaving no one behind in this convention. Just before I ask one last question, maybe I would like to tell everyone who's listening to us that you can ask your question in English or in French. We can translate it. So yeah, do not hesitate. I'd like to go back to the role and the crucial role of the private sector and large companies, because at the end of the day, they're mainly responsible for operationalizing this convention, right? And so I was wondering if in the convention there are any provisions or like concrete recommendations to what can be done, and if it also recommends that states have a duty to accompany the private companies in the operationalization of this convention. And also, in a world where private companies are gaining power, but yet are able to escape accountability lines, how can we hold? You've said how we can hold states accountable, but how do you think we can hold companies, especially large multinational companies, accountable for implementing this convention?
It's a really good question. And of course, you talked about the law earlier. And of course, it has to start with a legal framework, where that is also applied to them, where the state follows up. So that's one entry point, and a very important one, especially for those employers that may not be as easily persuaded and inspired also, and committed to these changes. And some are. So that's why you have to really work on all fronts. I just mentioned also the opportunity, which we have seen in some contexts, of also it's in, beyond whether a convention is ratified or not, more progressive businesses taking on, the recommendations into their own space. And they can be the business leaders also that inspire others. So if you, in your environment, there are business leaders that you think could be progressive, in the same way there may be progressive businesses around climate change. We have seen them, there are some that are truly committed and want to make a difference about the carbon footprint, and, in the same way, around the topics of violence and, living up to that kind of ethical standard. I'm thinking of kind of what could be the, ethical stamp, you see what I mean, where that comes with a product that, because you have been certified as really living up to a convention, and you're not waiting for your country to be ratified. In the same way we see the bio label, I'm thinking of, how can a movement be inspired also among some of the progressive leaders that are genuinely concerned about gender-based violence, because they see it, they're horrified by it. And then there's of course, the importance of working on all fronts, like in any good movement. In order for it to change, really to emerge, you have to work on all those fronts. So you work with the progressive business leaders that can really lead by example, show how it concretely can look like, because also some may be, on the edge just because they don't know what the concrete solutions may be. in order to bring this to life. So when there's clear examples of what it looks like in reality, not only in theory, it can help enormously to trigger change. So, that's a whole area of work, which I think, especially, we at CARE, for example, we also get support for our work from some business philanthropies. And, that's a good starting point, because those are the ones that already donate to the causes of justice and equality. And that is true for many civil society actors, that where we have progressive businesses that are supporters of fighting poverty and inequality in the world. So that is one opportunity. But then, of course, you need also, kind of the support to governments to follow up accountability mechanisms, and the recommendations that I mentioned that are not legally binding, that are really crucial. They're not legally binding, but they actually lay out a very, very good and excellent blueprint for governments to follow. So it's good not only to read the convention, but the accompanying recommendations, because we don't want every government to figure this out on their own. And it includes also concrete recommendations on how to hold the private sector accountable.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'd like to ask a last question. And talking about ethical standard, I definitely believe that raising our ethical standards starts with awareness raising. And this is, I hope, what we achieved tonight, and what we might want to continue to work on with a recommendation that you might want to advise to the audience. And this is something we usually do at Penser l'Après, meaning that we ask for books, articles, films, art pieces, what you would like the audience to have a look at, so as to get some more food for thoughts on the topic. So I'll give you the floor for the final recommendation.
Well, I think, I myself would like, if you have ideas on art and films that, speak to it, that's a really good question. I may not have one at the top of my mind, but what I would say, that probably among all of you who are listening, there's probably not anyone who has not heard a story of a friend, of a family member, that has not been harassed at work. So I would say, as in everything that is about transformation, it starts with ourselves. And among you, there may be many that have been harassed at work. Not only have you heard about stories, but you have been harassed at work. So it's a terrible event for it to happen. And let's gain strength because we know that, this is a true quest for justice. This is a true issue, a pandemic that especially those most discriminated against, women, LGBTIQ, people with disability, people of migrant communities, are particularly vulnerable about. So I think get those stories out, talk about them, and use them to really ground your activism in the reality that we know is close to all of us, or even embedded in our own reality, in our own workplace or home. So, get inspiration from that, because it's real, it's true, it's pervasive, it's global, it happens everywhere. So always be reminded that this is not just, something we may want to talk about because there happens to be the opportunity of this wonderful dialogue or a panel. This is real. This happens across the globe. And find your energy to act from the reality that you all know.
Well, thank you so much, Sofia, for this powerful recommendation. I think from all the webinars, out of the all webinars I did, I think this is the first time that I hear such a recommendation. But thank you so much, because I guess that for social fights, it always starts with listening to people directly concerned or that testify or that could have experienced or seen something. And so important just to be aware that they are here out there and that they might want to talk, and that the key thing is to be able to listen and truly listen. So thank you for such a recommendation. And you mentioned it several times during this webinar, but we're going to have a third webinar, which is the final conference of this series regarding the forum, the Generation Equality Forum, and this is going to be held with Sophie Binet from the CGT, as well as Alice Bodaker from Action Aid, both organizations you mentioned in your talk. And this is going to provide our audience with a French perspective on this convention, the challenges, the barriers of the government and of civil society, if there are any, to ratify this convention, and what we can expect for the Generation Equality Forum.
I'll make sure to listen in. I will be there and listening. Merci à tous. C'était magnifique d'être aujourd'hui avec vous. Et
merci beaucoup
pour l'attente. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Thank you so much.
Merci. Bye. Gracias. Bye.